good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. I know we have people coming in from all different countries today. And welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking all about how to eliminate the gender pay gap in civil and public services. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants and public servants all around the world. Now, in terms of today's topic, some countries require businesses to publicly report their gender pay gaps annually in a bid to kind of put pressure on those companies that have a big gap to close and to help job seekers to decide which might be the best companies that they want to work for. But governments, public services also need to take action to address their own pay gaps if they are going to kind of demonstrate commitment to gender equality and lead by example. And even in those countries where women account for almost an equal number of senior positions in government departments, the pay gap still remains, so revealing something deeper going on. So today we're going to hear from three fantastic speakers from the public sector, and we're going to be covering issues such as how can governments reduce and eliminate their gender pay gap? What are the factors, those stubborn factors that are still there behind these pay gaps? And what sort of initiatives and policies are successful in trying to reduce that pay gap? So we're going to hear from our speakers on those issues and much more, but there will be an opportunity for you, our audience, to put your questions to our speakers once they have given their opening remarks. And please do take this opportunity to put any questions that you have about this topic to our three great speakers. So on whichever device you are using, you should be able to see somewhere on that a Q&A button. At any point, use that Q&A button to send in your question or your comment, and I will make sure we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. But now I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and then I'm going to invite them each to give some opening remarks. So first, we are going to hear from Renée Roussel, who is currently the Director General at Federal Programs within Employment and Social Development Canada, and she is responsible for workplace equity in the federal private sector and federal workers' compensation services in the federal public service. Renée has been a public servant for over 25 years and has worked for organisations such as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Parks Canada Agency, Department of National Defence, and most recently, Employment and Social Development Canada in the Labour Programme. Then we will hear from Lucille Felby, who is Assistant General Secretary at the FDA, which is the trade union representing professionals and managers in public service here in the UK. With a strong commitment to equalities, Lucille has in-depth experience of public sector pay, job evaluation, and pay and grading development and processes. She's worked in the union movement for 20 years and previously worked for Unison, moving through the organisation in a range of roles. In her current position, she leads and manages a team of national officers and, amongst many other things, has strategic responsibility for equality, diversity and inclusion, senior salaries, review body evidence, and pensions and civil service compensation scheme. And then last but by no means least, we'll hear from Katie Philp, who is Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer at the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario in Canada. Before joining the Pay Equity Commission in 2020, Commissioner Philp worked to increase women's participation in international trade and the labour market. Her expertise has taken her around the world with legislators to establish programmes and legislation that support women-led enterprises. Katie is a Queen's Diamond Jubilee medalist, recognised for her work contributing to significant economic improvement in various Canadian cities. And most recently, her Level the Playing Field video and podcast series exploring issues related to economics, equity, women, work and money was awarded a Gold Quill Award of Merit for Excellence in Government Communications. So I'm sure you'll agree we have three brilliant speakers with us here today. As I say, please do take this opportunity to message in your questions. That will make this webinar really, really interactive and interesting. Now I'm going to invite Renée to kick us off with her opening remarks. So over to you, Renée.
Thank you, Siobhan, and welcome everyone. I do want to acknowledge that I am joining you virtually on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe people. And of course, what is a presentation from the government without a PowerPoint presentation? I'll keep that brief and we'll be able to feature and showcase the work done from an employment equity perspective and reducing the gender pay gap. From a Government of Canada perspective, we've demonstrated our commitment to reducing gender pay gap, measure progress, and build on accountability mechanisms through the continual advancement of our legal framework and indicators. I'm here from an Employment Equity Act perspective, which is Canada's longest standing proactive legal framework aimed at removing barriers for 4 designated groups, women being one of them, as well as Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. In the last few years, we've done a lot of work on pay gap reporting measures, which I'm very proud of and will speak to briefly today. But in 2024, we launched the site called Equivision, something that I'm extremely proud of. And it's an online data tool, which is the first of its kind, providing aggregate and designated group wage gap data for employers in the federally regulated private sector. It provides access to year-over-year data for each employer, tracking their progress in reducing representation and pay gaps that affect the 4 designated groups. And these initiatives will form the basis of my opening remarks this morning. Next slide, please. So since 1986, while some progress has been made over time and awareness of the importance of employment equity has increased, there has been minimal movement in the representation of women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities in the federally regulated private sector workplace. This chart is there to demonstrate the attainment rates for each designated groups. And when we speak to attainment rates, we talk about the extent to which representation of designated groups approaches, meets, or exceeds in our comparison to the labor market availability. An attainment rate of 100% would of course mean that the designated representation has met the labor market availability. However, since 1987, for women, we've only been able to bridge that gap at about 11.5%. In 1987, we were at 93%, and as of 2021, which was the last closing reporting data year, we were only at 81.6. The other designated groups have certainly been able to increase over time. However, only for persons, visible minorities, have we been able to exceed that labor market availability. Slide 3, please. I want to just take a step back with respects to explaining who and what is part of the Employment Equity Act. As Siobhan mentioned, we regulate the federally regulated private sector, and we require them to report for any employer who has 100 or more employees. That does include federal crown corporations and other federal organizations, as well as the Federal Core Public Administration and federal separate agencies of 100 or more employees, such as the Canada Revenue Agency. And of course, there's our Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But in terms of our government structure, we do have various representatives who are responsible. And much like my colleague here, Katie, from an Ontario perspective, our Minister of Labour is responsible for the Act, including that federal private sector. And then we have colleagues over at the Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission who are responsible for the Core Public Administration. All of these entities have an annual reporting requirement. However, only the Minister of Labour has a requirement to table a report to Parliament every year. And then we have our colleagues over at the Canadian Human Rights Commission who conduct compliance audits for both the federal public sector and regulated private sector with respect to compliance to these Act and regulations. Next slide, please. So who am I in the grand scheme of things, if you will? So the Labour Program, which falls under the Employment and Social Development Canada structure, administers what we call the Legislated Employment Equity Program. So LEAP for short, because of course government is great with its acronyms. And we have only approximately 582 employers as of 2022. And we only cover approximately 4% of the Canadian workforce. So the work that we do with our provincial counterparts and the work that we do with our international colleagues is important to ensure that we have that representation globally in terms of where we want to be and where we want to go. Slide 5, please. So this is giving you a bit more data. So while education and work experience gaps are narrowing, the gap in pay between men and women persists among workers in Canada. In Canada, in 2021, for every dollar a man earned, a woman earned 89 cents, as measured in the hourly wages for full-time workers. Some of the reasons, because we've done a number of evidence-based studies and issued a number of evidence-based reports, some of the reasons, which will be likely of no surprise to the individuals who are participating today, are the inflexibility in standard hours of work, the workforce interruptions, the lower likelihood of negotiating over salaries, raises, and promotions, and of course, gender discrimination in hiring. Among federally regulated private sector employees in permanent full-time positions in 2021, 72% of men and 82% of women earn less than $100,000 per year. Next slide, please. So before I launch into the pay transparency measures, and I promise this is a short presentation, I want to highlight the work done in recent years and the link between employment equity and pay equity. The Government of Canada fulfills its commitment to addressing pay gaps through the introduction of pay transparency measures for private sector employers subject to the Employment Equity Act. This did include pay gap reporting under the Employment Equity Act, but also the proactive pay equity under the Pay Equity Act. These two pieces of legislation measure essentially targeted pay gaps amongst federally regulated employees. They are meant to be complementary initiatives, but are independent from each other and differ in how they are applied, administered, and enforced. What is missing from this slide is the employment equity modernization work that is now being carried out, and I can certainly speak to that during our discussions. Next slide, please. So this gives you the key differences. From a pay gap reporting perspective, I mentioned that we are focused on the federally regulated private sector with 100 employees or more. And you'll see in the tool, these are the, from our perspective, the airlines, so the telecommunications, the air transportation, road transportation, a lot of the large employers, although we say 580 of them, it covers approximately 809,000 employees globally or across Canada. And it includes detailed pay gaps for the organization as a whole and 14 occupational groups for all 4 designated groups. So breaks it down when we talk to senior management versus the trade workers versus the administrative staff. And it's now available through public reporting with Equivision. From a pay equity perspective, our colleagues, both at the federal and the provincial level, they are looking at the federally regulated public and private sectors. At the federal level, this applies to 5,000 employers and employing over 1.4 million workers. So they certainly have a larger demographic, and they're looking at identifying and correcting systemic gender-based discrimination by establishing pay equity plans. There's an annual statement that's sent directly from employers to the Pay Equity Commissioner. However, there's no public report and posting it at this time. So let me conclude so that we can hear from my fellow panelists in terms of the next slide. As I mentioned, Canada's new Equivision website makes up the first for our country in terms of being able to publish pay gap that go beyond gender. The website provides the public with information on representation rate and pay gaps for women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disability, and members of visible minority. The online information includes comparable data gap information, and this is really important in terms of being able to break it down for women versus men, as well as in those 14 different occupational groups, so that you can see the progress, hopefully, or the challenges that the employers face with respects to being able to bridge that gap in terms of where things are going. Fairly new, we consider it fairly new because it was only launched in February. However, we've already received over 24,000 visits. There's been very, very positive media coverage, and I've included in the last slide the information so that you can go see. Anyone in the public can look at it. And we've listened to Canadians who've told us that they want pay discrimination to end. It's important that we get this right. This initiative provides the information needed so that employers and employees can find solutions to recognize the value of all workers. So publishing pay gaps raised the awareness about this issue, and we're very proud of that today. So I'll just conclude by saying that we are committed to further reducing the gender wage gap, and you can go to the next slide. And we continue to work to achieve equality in the workplace and reduce underrepresentation and pay gap for women. We look forward to hearing from the others on their experience on pay transparency and monitoring, including the gender, but also other identity factors to promote gender equality and diversity in the world of employment. Thank you.
Renee, thank you so much. A really interesting place to start, because you've given us the kind of overview of the legislation that's in place, linking those to the employment equity legislation with the pay equity legislation, how those two might work together. And also showing kind of the representation still an issue, as well as the pay being still an issue. You also flagged up, which I'm sure others will echo, and probably we will see, there's already questions coming in, but some of maybe the reasons behind some of the gaps that we're seeing, the inflexibility around the hours and the kind of working practices, negotiations around promotion and around job moves, discrimination in hiring practices, and also breaks that women might take for caring responsibilities, for example. So all of those things may be underlying factors. I just want to clarify one thing before I invite Lucille to come in. So you're saying in the Equivision tool that you have there, that's already, you've got data about the private sector, the federally regulated private sector. And are you hoping then that the public sector data will also be put into that tool? Was that right in my understanding of it?
It is something that's being looked at as part of the Employment Equity Act modernization, recognizing that that we only report on the federally regulated private sector, but that we do govern through the legislation that public sector piece as well.
Fantastic. Because one of the questions that's come in is, how do we compare the gap in the public service and the private sector? So we'll come back to that question, I think, when we come on to our wider conversation. Thanks so much, Rennie. Lucille, I'm coming over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Really interesting, wasn't it? Right, so excuse me, catch my voice again. So I'm going to talk about the gender pay gap and the state of play in terms of the UK civil service and public services predominantly at the first bit, and then I'll go on to a bit about the barriers, and then also touch on the gender pensions pay gap as well. So since 2017, public and private sector employees with more than 250 employees have been required to annually publish data on their gender pay gap within their organisations. So gender pay gap is generally defined in the UK as the difference between the median hourly earnings of men and of women as a percentage of those men's earnings. So the TUC, which is a trade union affiliated body which covers over 5.5 million workers, and FDA, who I work for, are part of that affiliated body, and they've done a significant analysis of the pay data. So the current gender pay gap is at 14.3%, which means the average woman must work 52 days, nearly 2 months, before she starts getting paid in comparison to the average man. This gets worse as you get older. So women aged between 50 and 59, which is myself, has the highest pay gap, and they work equivalent of 72 days for free. Again, disabled women also face the highest pay gap, and that's 35% in comparison to non-disabled men, and that's the equivalent of £7,000 a year. Clearly, the pay gap varies by sector, and I'm sure we'll come into that, but the highest pay gap in the UK is in finance and insurance. And even in female-dominated sectors like education, the pay gap is high, say at 21%. So not necessarily the only factor. The gender pay gap for full-time employees has been gradually decreasing since 1997, where it's been tracked. During this time, the proportion of full-time employees who are women has increased, and at the same time, the share of part-time employees who are men has increased, which has had most of the impact on that reduction. But since 2011, the pay gap has been closing by about 0.4 percentage points a year. But at current rates, that'll take up to 2044 to close that gap. So we're looking at a very persistent and assisting kind of problem. I just want to touch on the UK civil service, because obviously the union that I work for is predominantly based in the UK civil service. And here we can see, and I'll come on to some of the barriers, but there's 50,000 more women than men in the civil service. However, men outnumber women at the higher grades, so grade 6 and 7 and the senior civil service level, which has an impact on the gender pay gap. Also, civil servants from an ethnic minority background are less represented at senior grades than in junior grades, and again, has the lowest representation within the senior civil service. There's also the percentage of civil servants who describe themselves or declare themselves as disabled remains below the economic active working population. So those sort of issues impact on the pay gap. Yeah. In terms of the gender pay gap, like UK trends, the civil service is reducing. This year's statistics show 2 departments which have higher than 14% gender pay gap, which is the Cabinet Office and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And that is primarily due to the demographic of those departments. There is big variations in the bonus pay gap across departments, and that's something also that employers have to report on. So at the most senior level, you can get a bonus pay gap of 17.8%, which is absolutely absurd. And we have raised it in our evidence to the Senior Salaries Review Body. But I think now just moving on to the barriers, I think, in terms of the causes of the gender pay gap are complex and varied and long term. Direct discrimination plays a part in women's lower wages, particularly for older women who entered the labour market on less equal terms than men, and who may face dual discrimination on the ground of age and gender. However, the structural factors, which are the key cause to the gender pay gap, occupational segregation, part-time pay penalty, women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid caring, and women's concentration in low-paid, highly feminised sectors. Just going into a bit more of those details. So in age, it's interesting, there's very little difference between the median hourly rate between men and women in their 20s, but the substantial gap emerges for full-time employees of 40 and over. And that absolutely links to parenthood, which I'll come back to as a main feature. Occupation, the gap tends to be smaller in occupational groups where a large proportion of employees are women. Who knew? But the Office of National Statistics analysis found that 23% of the gender pay gap could be explained by occupational differences between men and women. Industry, as I've talked about earlier, the pay gap is the largest in the finance industry and the smallest in the accommodation and food services industry. Public and private sector, full-time workers, the pay gap is slightly smaller in the public sector than the private sector, and there's a negligible gender pay gap for part-time workers in the private sector, which contrasts with the large part-time pay gap in the public sector. But that's because women make up the higher share of employees in the public sector than the private sector. There are regional differences. So full-time gender pay gap is highest in the southeastern London, which isn't, for those of you who live in the UK, probably wouldn't be sort of surprised, but it's also negative in Northern Ireland, which is interesting. And then finally, the highest earners have the largest pay gap than the lowest earners, which again fits with those other issues that we have raised. I think I want to really concentrate on the motherhood and gender pay gap, because I think there's some cracking statistics here, but analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies found that the most of the gender pay gaps can be traced to child penalties, or as we know it, parenthood. It finds the average earnings of men are almost completely unaffected by parenthood, but women's earnings fall sharply when they become parents and then stabilise at a much lower level with little growth. The IFS found that 7 years after the birth of the first child, women's earnings are on average less than half of men's. This also plays into the gender pay gap, which I'll come into later. Between 1991 and 2015, the pay gap between mothers and fathers was around 10% before the birth of their first child. But that gap widens to 30% by the time that child is aged 13. I mean, just phenomenal. So there we can sort that out by sorting out range of rights and entitlements to parents and carers and so on. But we'll come on to can resolve these issues. Just finally, on very quickly, I think the gender pensions gap is also interesting in that it's caused by that gender pay gap. That's several issues. You know, there's different working patterns over a period of people's working lives. There's different earnings. Women on average earn less than men. There are factors relating to pensions that may cause the gender gap in terms of difference between what types of pension scheme men and women may be in because of the types of employment that they have. Historic state pension rules, which have different contributions and outcomes for men and women. And we have now sort of state enrolled pensions, but that can also affect men and women because of their employment patterns. And finally, divorce settlements and how that is treated in pensions can have a massive impact on individuals. So hopefully I've sort of thrown some good stats out there in terms of the trauma of gender pay, but there are some key systemic and structural barriers that I think, you know, we've got to start to work on those to affect that change. But I'm sure we'll explore those in the questions. So thank you, Siobhan.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucia. I think that's brilliant. You've given us that kind of end-to-end, I think, showing where the pay gap gets impacted all throughout the kind of full career lifespan. Really stark statistics. I think some of the things you said there in terms of how many days women have to work for nothing, essentially, to be paid the same as their male colleagues, but also showing how it differs across sectors. It differs depending on your age as well, with older women being disproportionately hit even harder, I think, than women coming in to the workforce now. The difference across the types of work that people do, which because women higher numbers of women in different types of work, how that impacts on it as well. And really interesting what you say there about motherhood and parenthood and how that has an impact on women, but hardly has an impact on men. And actually, over time, it gets even worse if you follow that through as people's children get older. And then it doesn't even end there. So as you say, it carries on into pensions and the gap in the pensions. So much information in there. And I think lots of things, and echoing what Renee said about some of those issues underlying it, direct discrimination, in particular against the older women, but also some of those structural issues around kind of part-time pay discrimination and also the impact of caring and taking time out from your career. Thank you so much. Lots of food for thought and lots of questions coming in already, some of which very interesting questions coming in. I'm sure we'll all have opinions on some of those. Katie, we're coming over to you, though, for the final remarks before we get into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much once again for having me. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. I just want to start by sharing a map of Canada to give you a sense of the different types of legislation we have. There's a legend here. Canada is a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary democracy, and essentially a federation of provinces and territories. And, Renee shared the sort of federal employment and equity legislative frameworks, which apply to federally regulated employers. But then the provinces and territories have a lot of autonomy on how they treat employment and pay equity, pay transparency in their individual provinces for sectors that are not federally regulated. So you can see that there's quite a mix of policy tools across Canada. And just to show Ontario is there, the letters ON, we probably have the most robust collection because we have a standalone pay equity statute, which was the first globally to introduce the concept of pay equity as equal pay for work of equal value or comparable worth that applies to both public and private sectors. So we cover both public and private sectors. We have employment standards, we have a human rights code, and we have pay transparency, all working together to tackle the issues of pay discrimination. So you can see, citizens in Ontario are quite robustly covered. We do a lot of jurisdictional scanning across Canada, but also globally. And what we've learned is, countries or provinces or subnational governments that have some form of reporting requirement, we see the gender wage gap closing much quicker. So it'll be interesting to see, Renee's great work in the next few years as the reporting becomes much more of a trend across Canada. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit about who we are, so I'm head of the Ontario Pay Equity Commission, which is made up of the Pay Equity Office and the Tribunal. The office runs the day-to-day regulatory framework and enforcement, a lot of outreach and education, and then also we've got a ton of monitoring, replying to complaints, all of those things. The Tribunal is a quasi-judicial body that if people don't like the outcome of our decision made at our office, they can go and appeal it. What I think it's important to share here, though, is the purpose of the act as it was created was to redress systemic discrimination in compensation for work performed by employees. So it's not just work employed by women, because there's also men and intersectional identities. So work performed by employees in female job classes. And so essentially what we're doing is looking at the sort of systemic issue and really challenging the since the construction of the paid labor market, men and women have been paid differently, and that's been defined by law. And so, oftentimes we hear a very naive argument against pay equity saying, well, the differences arise from choice. And it's not really choice when you look at the prescriptive laws that literally define what men and women can do in the labor market. And up until the 1970s across Canada, North America, I'm not as familiar with the European markets, but there were laws that kept women out. There were, if a woman was married, her salary at the federal government was a lot less than if a woman who was unmarried, because the concept was, well, the male's a breadwinner. There were marrying teacher laws. So once a teacher got married, she had to leave the labor market because she was expected to be a housewife. There were laws that limited how many hours women could work in specific places because the government believed those places weren't safe or ideal for women. So I think the purpose really of this is to kind of correct those historic systemic, and that's when we talk about the barriers, that's a real issue, because we don't think about how codified in our system labor inequalities are, because it was just these assumptions, at the turn of or not even the turn of the century, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the creation of a mass paid labor market, how the laws back then created these barriers, and how, yes, those laws have started to go away. I mean, 1974, 76, 77, this is when some of them disappeared, is not that long ago. So it takes time to make those shifts happen in the labor market and change people's ideas and beliefs about women's bodies at work. And this is what this act tries to do, and it's doing it effectively. It says, no, we have undervalued certain jobs because they've been done historically by women. Now those occupations are also done by men. So in fact, we are servicing any employee who is in a job that's been historically or stereotypically labeled as women's work. So it's a really an act that has its foundation in human rights, in labor law. We believe that this should be a self-managed process, so employers are expected to go through and do the pay equity analysis. And we focus on gender neutrality. So we focus on trying to remove that discrimination that's sort of embedded in what we believe certain genders do in the workforce by taking it out. And we allow for flexibility in the interpretation, and especially during the process of collective bargaining. We really want employers and unions to work together to find the best solution in terms of finding pay equity within the institution. And I think it's important to mention that our act applies within an institution. So it's not sectoral. We're not trying to find pay equity sectorally or across, a certain job class across every company needs to be paid the same. We're looking within one company, one institution at a time. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we use the concept equal pay for work of equal value, which is this notion of comparable worth. And really, as I already said, it's to correct this historic, legislated, encoded idea of how we coded work and what we believed about men and women at the Industrial Revolution that still has remnants in our labor market today. So we're very committed to that definition and helping employers understand comparable worth within their workplaces and giving them tools to do that. So I'll close with just sharing the next slide, the final slide. Just some tools and resources if you want to learn more about how we do that and what's been effective. We have, as Siobhan mentioned, Level the Playing Field is a podcast series where we dive into some of these topics. We've created a pay equity solution for small business. So it's a do-it-yourself kit you can walk through because there's 7 steps to achieving pay equity, which can be overwhelming. But we go through each one in detail and it's all templated. We also have a Q&A guide to our acts so people can, get really granular if they want. We've been around for over 35 years, so you can see case references and how the courts have actually interpreted our act over the years. And finally, there's a regression calculator. Sounds really boring and nerdy, but it's really useful for employers to get in and figure out their compensation data and to look at it to find equity. So I can see my colleague has dropped some links in the chat, and you're welcome to do a deep dive on these tools to see how we've been able to close the gap over time in Ontario.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. And as you say, we have actually sent out around on the chat links to everybody who's on, and we'll send that to everyone who is registered as well. But really interesting just to hear about the work that you do and the work that's come from the Pay Equity Office, and also a reminder of just how historically some of these issues have been embedded in the past, and also how it's not been that long really that we've been working to try and overturn some of these historic problems. Really interesting the way that some things, and I think that's still there, that some things are seen as women's work, so they're considered to be of less value. And I really like the way that you have equal pay for work of equal value. I think that kind of sums it up nicely. But also one of the things that I think strikes me from all of your presentations there, and you mentioned it right at the end of yours, is that you've been doing this for 35 years, but the importance of data and how data now and having that information about what is happening is really being used to drive change is so important in terms of shining a light on what's actually happening. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you so much to Renee and Lucille. Really great opening presentations to kick us off on our conversation. And as I say, we do have lots of questions coming in. There was the one I noticed, which I think, Lucille, I'm going to put this to you first because I think you touched on this. You gave some stats on this, and Isatu Sar has sent in a lot of questions. And one of them was, how does the gender pay gap in civil and public services compare to that in the private sector? And what unique challenges does it present in terms of addressing pay disparities? So I think, Lucille, am I right in saying that the public sector is slightly smaller, the gap in the UK in the public sector compared to the private sector? Can I come back to you on that? And also, are there particular challenges in the private sector that make it harder, or in the public sector that make it harder for them to address this pay gap?
Yes, absolutely. There are. I suppose there's 2 different things to look at. I suppose the full-time employees is lower in the public sector than the private sector, but both pay gaps are higher than the 7.7% of the gender pay gap for all full-time employees, if you see what I mean. So, yeah. But yeah, I think probably what the difference is that sectoral issue in terms of finance and insurance, because that pay gap is 27.9%. Okay. So that will work its way through in terms of, if you think that the overall pay gap is 14% across all sectors, that probably helps to demonstrate where those differences are. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And then I'm going to ask Renee and Katie as well. Do you have any sense of how the public sector pay gap compares to the private sector pay gap from where you're sitting? Katie, you're nodding, so I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Research that we've been looking at, and this is, across Canada, Ontario, globally. Public sector, the gaps are smaller and closing faster. And also that's partially related to the unionization rates. We know that higher unionization rates leads to greater chances or likelihood of achieving pay equity. As you know, unions don't bargain on behalf of gender, they bargain on behalf of a job class or a job title. So you're more likely to achieve that. The issue though, and that would be, again, that internal pay equity where if you have women clustered in certain jobs and those jobs are consistently or historically devalued, then that becomes a question of doing internal equity to make sure that the women's work that is being, primarily done by women is valued appropriately. But we do see that trend in Ontario and even globally as well when we look at public sector unionization rates, which is a great positive trend.
Thanks, Katie. And Renee, this goes back to that. I think this is why I was interested in whether the public sector are already putting information into the Equivision tool. Do you have a sense of where the comparison is at the moment?
Well, I'll just add to what Katie mentioned in terms of the Equivision tool, and we often get asked why labor market availability, and we talked about this sort of in our pre-brief. Data is important, so we partner quite specifically with Statistics Canada, because Statistics Canada will give us the private and the public sector data across Canada when we look at that labor market availability. So while I certainly can't give you statistics on the private sector, I can tell you that that's the rating that goes into making sure that we're able to do that comparison in terms of the data and where Equivision can go. Because whether it is the federally regulated private sector or the public sector, as Katie mentioned, in a unionized environment, you have the job classification groups, you have the rates of pay. I don't think we should say that makes it perfect, in the sense that there are still significant gaps with respects to that, but it gives us the opportunity to do that comparison, to do that sort of visualization in terms of how we can bridge those gaps.
Thanks. And you all mentioned some of those underlying challenges, some of the factors kind of behind the pay gap. And the first question that came in from Isatu Sar is, what initiatives are being undertaken to promote gender diversity and inclusion in leadership positions within civil and public service organisations, and how do they impact on pay equality? I really like this question. So I think it's, as if you get a more diverse and a more kind of equal leadership cadre, does that impact on the gender pay gap? Do we have any evidence to show that might be the case? Katie, I will come to you.
That's a great question. Not that long ago, a Globe and Mail reporter, Globe and Mail is our big sort of national newspaper in Canada, did a deep dive on Canadian public sector pay gaps. And she was looking at it because we have a sunshine list. So if your salary is above a certain threshold, so it's management and above basically whose salaries are published. And what she actually found was there was not really a substantial pay gap for women in leadership in the public sector. Like, that was not the story, which is sort of, I guess, disappointing for her. But what she did find was there was a participation gap. There was a lot less women. So the women who had made it to the top in senior management were making about the same as men, but women were not making it to the top. So it really made the public sector look at how do we actually then create that pipeline. And some of the issues were already talked about. Lucille mentioned, the motherhood penalty. We call it a motherhood penalty because it is, and it's a fatherhood boost, right? Men are seen as more responsible when they have children. They tend to get raises and promoted. Women are seen as like, oh my God, a liability because she's going to be caring for her kid all the time. So we started to look at, and I think at least the Ontario public sector has done a good job of creating that pipeline and really focusing on women in leadership and getting the pipeline full and putting women through training programs and supportive measures, and creating, as you mentioned, the flexible hours of work. Like, what do women need to be able to contribute fully, and pushing them through? And I think that's been a huge, after that article, the OPS, I think, the Ontario public sector responded in a way to figure out how to fill that pipeline to get women up. The good news of that article was, though, the gap didn't really exist. It was a participation gap, not a pay gap.
Thanks. Lucille, I want to come on to that, though, because I think my understanding is you said that there is a pay disparity in kind of senior roles. It's not just a participation issue in the UK, although that is a big issue. But when you do have men and women in senior roles, women are getting paid less than men. Was I right in that?
Yeah, I think overall, in terms of the Office of National Statistics is higher earners. The pay gap is as high. I mean, in the civil service, that's the only more detail that I have. The senior civil service level pay gap is about 4.2% overall, which is actually less. So in that sense, and I suppose it does make a difference, doesn't it? If you've got a more diverse workforce, that will help. But it also, if you're looking at a particular employer, what's the shape of that employer? So if you've got the majority of your workers are in the lower grades, then that will distort that, because even if you've got lots of women at the top, it doesn't actually deal with that proportionality as it goes up through the structures. But I think as an advocate for equality and equity and also diversity, that all of those tools or management change things that any employer can do that helps promote people through the systems and through the grades has to have an impact more generally on an employer. Doesn't necessarily follow through in terms of that, how gender pay gap is reported. I mean, that doesn't, I suppose I was just thinking a bit about, that doesn't relate to, in a way, the Equal Pay Act that we've got from 1970, which I think is more in line with what Katie was expressing earlier, in that sense of equal pay for equal value and trying to deal with some of those systemic issues. But again, within the public services, you've got much more rigour in terms of pay and grading structures and obvious ways to move through them. But that doesn't mean that there still isn't unfair pay going on in there. But it's less likely than in the private sector.
Thanks, Cecile. And Renee, you started your presentation by talking about representation before you moved on to pay. So how important do you think it is, going back to this question, that we do, there are more efforts to get equality in the senior leadership positions? Will that have a kind of knock-on effect on the pay issues?
Yeah, well, I think it is important. Like we've teased out different elements, whether it be data, the history of the act, and we all know legislation is not easy to change, jurisprudence, decisions that have been brought through over the years. These to me are all evidence-based elements that can really help us from a gender pay gap move us forward from that perspective. We recently partnered with a behavioral insights team, a Canadian company, to develop a guide for employers that suggests that evidence-based actions can be taken by employers for all of the designated groups. So women being one of them, and certainly happy to share. I don't necessarily have someone readily available to post it in the chat, but happy to share what that guide is, because in the areas of focus and actions that can be taken, there are effective measures that would allow that gap to shrink through those representation groups. And one of the big things in leadership and women in leadership is setting those internal targets for representation and equality. So equal work for equal pay. Like we know that in the federal public sector, you already have the classification groups, but you still don't have the numbers, and that's in part from what Katie and Lucille have certainly raised as part of our discussion today. So what else can be done, and what are those effective behavioral changes and the systemic changes that can be made to be effective for women to reduce that gap are part of that guide. But it's focused on evidence-based actions that employers can take, and I think that just continues the narrative in terms of where we want to go.
Thanks. Well, I want to pick up on that, continue in that kind of vein. There's a question coming from an anonymous attendee. I don't know if this is from a man or a woman who's asked this question, but it's picking up on this issue of we've talked about women not having the same number of women in certain types of jobs as we have men. And this question is around are women not filling those positions that have the higher pay? Why are they not filling those positions that have the higher pay? And also, how do you balance that with the fact, and I don't know if this is true or not, so I'm going to ask Katie and Renee, but are positions in Public Service Canada also remunerated by experience? So you're paid more for the number of years of service that you have, and those two things together. So maybe women taking time out for caring responsibilities or having children or whatever, does that mean they're then paid less by default because men have more years experience? And how do you kind of balance those things? So I'm going to come to Renee first on this one, because I don't know how paying by experience fits with equal pay for equal value. There's definitely a tension there. Am I right in thinking that? Renee, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension. From a public service perspective, there's years of service, but it's more about the classification group and the rates within the classification groups. So it doesn't necessarily primarily focus on gender. However, as we talked earlier, when a woman is away from a childcare perspective, it also avoids them being able to have those opportunities that are brought in through the system. But in the federal private sector, that's why we look at the employment equity occupational groups more systemically in terms of making sure that there is that equal pay for the equal work. We know that there are some, women-dominated groups, some men-dominated groups, but breaking that barrier within those two categories would certainly help minimize on some of those pieces in terms of where we can go with pay equity, with employment equity, and with diversity in the workplace as we move forward.
And I'm kind of reluctant to go down the route, which I think the question is getting at, why are some of those male-dominated groups and why are some of them, because I think that's a whole nother webinar in terms of kind of if we got into that conversation. But Lucille, this issue of, because you mentioned it with the motherhood issue and it really impacting women. So is there a tension between paying people for the type of work they're doing, but also just paying people for having more years in an organization? How do you balance that kind of tension?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was trying to think that through in terms of, so at the moment within the civil service, you don't have pay progression. So people start on a pay level and stay on that, which is an issue we're trying to pick up. So in that sense, it shouldn't impact you in terms of you're just carrying on working. I suppose, it does depend on how long a woman is out of the employment market, and then can they go back in at the level that they were at, or so I think that it's possibly more to do with that than men are, particularly in the public sector, rather that it's a gender thing. It's about the role, and like Renee was saying around those, they've got very specific ways of dealing with it. So I think it goes a bit more behind, why aren't parents able to take a lot of time off or a time off? And that, I think that helps to then recognise that, if a woman is out of the workplace for, it's not, sometimes it's more than a year and sometimes it's less, and all of those things, and how that impacts in that sense. And then that ongoing caring responsibility and how that's perceived by employers, managers, and so on. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
And Katie, I saved it for you last, Katie, because I think this must go to the heart of a lot of what you do.
It's a great question, because also the Pay Equity Act in Ontario acknowledges that there are going to be some disparities in pay due to, differences in education, differences in years of experience, a collective bargaining power. Even within my office, I have 2 different bargaining agents, and they, and we allow for that level of, differences in pay, because we understand that if one union is stronger, they are going to negotiate more effectively for their members. So, and we understand that, if I have a level 6 in my office who's been within the public sector for 12 years, her pay is probably higher than a level 6. Marginally higher than a level 6 who's been in the OPS for 2 years. And that's because we do have, annual adjustments for inflation and those types of things. So I think it's important, especially from the employer perspective, that the act be flexible enough to allow to understand, and employees understand that, yes, There are some things that get remunerated differently, which keeps, I think, healthy competition and growth happening in the labor market. And also, an employee is rewarded if they go and invest money in a course and they increase their education, that gets recognized and reflected in their pay, because then they're probably given more responsibility and are paid to reflect that. So our Act does allow for those discrepancies as long as they are justified. If the employer can say, well, this is why it's happening, we allow for that. And we recognize that there's lots of factors that will create those little discrepancies, as long as they're based in something real, not, discrimination or favoritism or things that are not really related to the job and related to, like, this person has a better attitude and we like them more. Like, those types of things are not acceptable pay discrepancies, but we do know that that's a natural thing that evolves.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Okay, I'm going to merge two questions because I think they're related and I think they come back to the issue of data and transparency. So one question was around how can measures like gender pay reporting requirements and performance-based pay systems be leveraged to identify and address gender pay disparities? And then the other question, which I think links to this, is a lack of transparency in pay practices and unconscious bias, for example, one of the challenges and barriers to reducing the gender pay gap? So I'm going to put two of those together and ask you, to what extent do you think shining a light on kind of the data around gender pay reporting is actually bringing about change? And Renee, I'll start with you, because I imagine, are you also measuring through the Equivision website kind of the extent to which this is actually bringing about change as people start to be more transparent about what is actually going on?
Well, I think what's been important with the Equivision piece is, first and foremost, this is the employer's data. I think it's important that from a transparency perspective, there's no manipulation of the data. This is the true to fruition, where they're at with respects to the different measures from that perspective. And it certainly was an interesting exercise, if you will, with employers, because this is now publicly available data. I'm a huge fan of transparency, and I think data gets us that transparency. And as Katie mentioned, over the next few years, I think that's where we will see the efforts. We don't doubt the efforts that have been put on by employers. The challenge is you don't see the efforts that have been put by employers if you're not putting them in that public forum from that perspective. They do have an opportunity through a narrative report that is also public to explain that variable. But I do think that that's paramount in terms of being able to move forward. And as we are able to populate the year-over-year data, which will be coming soon, based on their annual report, then that comparability will also again, allow for that transparency to move forward. And I come back to what Katie mentioned earlier and what Lucille has certainly mentioned throughout the conversation. There are going to be variables year over year in terms of how we see things, whether they are in a unionized environment or a non-unionized environment. I think that the challenge remains being able to have those areas of focus that make sure that the barriers and the behaviors over time are exemplified through that data, and see where things can go. And this is just for a small group. This is just for that 4%. Would be great to see it for all of Canada in terms of being able to see in those different groups what the disparities can be and what the opportunities are as well. Because one of the challenges when employers talked about that comparable data, they talk about this idea of the public seeing one versus the other, but they are doing great work. The challenge is there's no way to get to it if you're not able to see it publicly as part of that transparency.
Yeah, so part of that, as you say, will be shining a light on good practice, and then hopefully that good practice can be shared across companies or across sectors as well to drive change. Katie, your thoughts on the importance of kind of data and transparency around performance?
It's hugely important, and I think Ontario, and you saw from the map, there's several provinces that are introducing pay transparency rules. I don't think the UK has any pay transparency legislation right now. I know the EU pay transparency directive is coming out. So there's, a tendency towards this. And I think it's from what we've seen from our research, it's one tool. It's not going to fix the problem entirely, but it's a complementary tool that works with other, like, and you saw, like, Ontario's legislative framework is robust. We have many different ways of tackling this. And ultimately that's what works, I think, from what we've seen through our research, is when you have lots of complementary tools. So the pay transparency empowers employees. And I think it also helps employers to really figure out what the labor market looks like and who's attracted to their jobs. And quite honestly, employees have been doing this grassroots for a very long time. Like sites like Indeed, Glassdoor, other, we've been sharing salary and compensation data for a very long time informally. So I think it just makes sense for governments and employers, to get ahead of it and create that framework, because now you have space where you're creating the opportunity for the conversation, and you can explain, you have salary bands, and you can explain if somebody believes they should be at the top of the band, why they're not. And you can explain that progression and what will get them to the top in a logical way that does not, isn't based on discriminatory practices or decision-making. So I think it brings a lot to the table in terms of helping to close these gaps.
Thanks, Katie. Lucille, you might come back on, but my understanding is, although we don't have legislation in the UK at the moment, that there are certain rules around certain organisations that have to publish this information.
Yeah, so the gender pay reporting is primarily, so that came in through the Equality Act in 2017, and that's for 250 plus employees. I think the trade union movement would say that should be less than that, and that they should increase that. And also, I think there's always been a case to be made for ethnic minority and disability reporting as well, because there's some definite factors in relation to pay. And I think just in more general terms, as I said in my presentation, it is reducing, but it's very, very slow. So 2024 at this moment, into 2044 at this moment in time. But actually, some of the factors that have affected that is less about the reporting and more about the demographics of change of the workforce. So, but absolutely agree that employers should publish, should be held to account, and as unions we always engage with our employers about, well, yours has gone up this year, why is that, what's the issues, how can we assist, what's going on in that sense. So I think it can develop that engagement with workforce, and it doesn't necessarily have to have a trade union. In private sector they'll have workforce representatives, and you can have that engagement that enables that understanding and knowledge, and that we can start to grow a better workplace for people.
Thanks, Cecile. I'm conscious that the conversation has gone really quickly. We've only got about 10 minutes left, and there's still a few questions to get through. I want to very quickly pick up on one that Michael has sent in a question. To be clear, Michael says, I don't agree with equity. Pay disparity is due to choices. My question is, how do you bring in equity without discriminating against people whose only sin is to be born into the unfavoured group, i.e. men? So, how do we ensure that Michael going forward is not discriminated against with some of the new maybe initiatives that are being brought in to improve gender equality and reduce the gender pay gap? We're probably going to give 30 seconds on this each, I think.
I can start.
Yes.
Because this is the point I was making in my intro comments around, that we have to be mindful that there were laws that systemically said women can't do certain jobs, and it was equally, I think, uncomfortable for men, and only men can do certain jobs. If a man wanted to be a teacher or a nurse, 50, 60 years ago, it would have been very uncomfortable for him to do that. So I think the point is that choice is sort of an interesting construct when it comes to women in the labor market, because we did not have choices at the beginning. We were forced out if we had children, we were forced out if we were married. So the laws are really there to correct those systemic issues that are literally built into our institutions. And so when we use choice as the only argument, I always, kind of cock my head and go, I don't know, because it's, the OECD published a report that as early as 5 years old, little boys and girls have ideas about the types of careers they can do based on play and exposure. So the question of choice is interesting, and I think we have to correct for that, and use, take away the historic blinders that we've forgotten about.
Thanks, Katie. Lucille, any thoughts on Michael's question?
Yeah, just building on what Katie said as well. I mean, I think, equity doesn't mean taking away from one to give to another. That's what I do not see as equity. So it shouldn't be at the cost of men's work or men's wages. It should be about equalisation. So I think in that sense, I'm with you. But I think that issue around choice is very difficult if you've got those systemic structural issues about caring and caring responsibility, how that is valued by both government and employers, or lack of value in it. And so actually that's the issue that we've all got to tackle. And the more men that get involved in that, the better, I would say.
Yeah, and actually some of the biggest advocates for change when I was in the civil service were men. They can be the biggest advocates for change, definitely. Renee, you can answer that question, or there is another question, I think, which probably picks up on something that you said in your presentation, which is, what do studies show that relates to pay gaps for women in marginalized groups? So it's kind of that intersectionality, I think, of some of the groups as well, and what steps are being taken to close this particular gap. So you can pick up on Michael's question or move on to the question around intersectionality, perhaps.
Well, I'll just say to that previous question, the only thing I would add is conversation, the continued conversation to be able to bring down those barriers, because and I'll link it to this question. I think there's a lot of evidence that is available that would allow specific actions that could be taken. The challenge is always, implementing them consistently and holistically across organizations. And that's why I refer back to the guide that we prepared. When we talk about leadership and accountability, something for women would be setting those internal targets for representation and equity, or appointing employee equity leads or task force so that you can continue, as I said, that conversation in terms of where we're going. In terms of recruitment, selection and hiring, or even just the ongoing progression, there are different areas of focus that show from an evidence perspective the effectiveness that has had within the different groups. And this was a national study done, an international study done. So I still think that the great work that's been done to try to move from legislation to action, I think, exists. And it's just a matter of the conversation and communicating and bringing it forward.
Thanks. I will move on. One final question, but I also want to bring in Vida's comment. So Vida Seegers just said, as a career nurse, I would argue men are still preferentially hired for higher paying jobs. So I guess that's giving the other side of Michael's question in terms of maybe their personal experiences. But my final question, and we're going to have really quick answers, I think, because this is one that came in advance as well. And Isitu, as one of her questions, is to tackle this gender pay gap, how important do you think collaboration is across, if you're talking about the public sector, across departments and unions working together, and in the private sector with companies kind of sharing good practice as well? So the importance of collaboration in addressing this as an issue that's affecting everyone. Renee, I will start with you.
Well, I think it's paramount. I think the challenge is that, we can't necessarily carve out the time. I mentioned during my presentation that, our act has been in place since 1986, which seems to me a bit aged. But in 2021, we looked to accelerate the review of the Employment Equity Act, and so many people had comments. There were over 100 meetings, 300 participation, 450 submissions, and that's just from people's comments. That conversation has to continue with the different groups. It's great to meet Lucille and Katie. And Katie, I'm sure our offices speak to your offices. I think it's just a question of time and timing, and making sure that the conversation continues, and events such as today help us to ensure that we continue that conversation.
Thanks, Renee. And Lucille, from kind of a union perspective, I imagine that you very much are in favour of more collaboration across different groups.
Yeah, it's our modus operandi, isn't it? No, absolutely. I mean, there's different levels, isn't there? I mean, I think there should be much more collaboration at governmental level. That there are some fundamental things that they can help to shift, whether that's statutory maternity pay or flexible working requests, which we know 1 out of 3 get rejected, you know, all of those system things that really impact on how people can work and work more effectively and don't have to work part-time, or they can both work part-time. But yeah, at an employer level, I think, you know, where we've got recognition agreements, we do have that good engagement, but we need to keep building on that. And like you say, cross-sector, looking across the trends. You know, there's some departments in the civil service that are doing really, really well. So what are they doing that's different from, you know, the Cabinet Office and what have you? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear you say how different the departments were on this, and does come down maybe to the nature of the work within that, but they could definitely be learning from each other. Thanks, Lucille. And Katie, your final thoughts on the importance of collaboration?
Well, I think, you know, to echo what Lucille and Renee already said, it's paramount. And, you know, especially being a subnational government, to really understand what's happening at the, you know, in our context, a national framework that influences, and then what we can do within that, within our own jurisdiction is really, really important. And then also, you know, where we have municipalities with their own jurisdiction. So being able to understand that flow of relationships is extremely important. I would also add, though, another level of collaboration is global. This is a great example and a great forum to share best practices. I've learned so much by being involved in the Equal Pay International Coalition. That's ILO, OECD, UN Women Coalition, and just to be able to learn and see what other jurisdictions are doing. And I think there's ways that we can, this forum like this is a great example to share, so we can bring that back as we're continuously improving.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm just looking at the clock and we are out of time. So I just want to say a big thanks to the audience for sending in so many great questions, especially to Isatu. Thank you for all of those questions. Thank you in particular to our fantastic speakers, so to Renee, to Lucille and to Katie, for sharing your expertise, sharing as well some resources that people can follow up with. I hope you found it useful. We have sent out to everybody who registered today a short questionnaire. So if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to answer that, just to make sure we keep giving you the types of webinars that are most useful for you. But on this notion of kind of collaboration and learning from each other, well, I also wanted to let you know about a couple of training courses that Global Government Forum will be running. So these are taking place on the 2nd and the 9th of July, and they're all about the subject of women into leadership. So they'll be picking up on a lot of the issues I think that we have touched on today. And you can find more information about those on the link that we've put there, or you can contact Raquel, who organised today's webinar. I think all of those details are on our website. And also, some of you might have come to this webinar because you're already part of Global Government Forum's Women's Network. So I think it's the first global network for women in the public sector. If you're not already part of that, I think we will be sending the link where you can join and become part of that network to you if you are watching today or registered for today. But thank you again from me, and thank you once again to our fantastic panel. Lots of insight there. I think it's good to hear that progress is being made, but I think it's safe to say there's still a way to go and more work to be done. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you on another one of our webinars very soon. Thanks a lot, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.